Anyway, it is great that you're here. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. We are thrilled to have a 10 by 9 tonight in partnership with Roe Valley, and our theme is in sickness and health. And it's great. Thanks very much to the magnificent people at Roe Valley Arts and Cultural Centre, for partnering with us again. We love being in the space with them. It's such a lovely thing to do. So thank you very much to the lovely people there. Is there anybody, Paul, from Roe Valley who's in here yet? Or are they on their way in?
Esther said she was coming. Oh, she is here. Yes.
Oh yeah. So, well, thanks very much, Esther.
It's her mum's birthday, so this is how they're spending the evening. Rock and roll.
Rock and roll. Storytelling on Zoom, when normally you'd have been painting the town red.
Okay. Yes, you are all in Limavady. You may not realize it, but you're all in a virtual Limavady. And I'm sure a lot of you, especially overseas, are going, where the hell is Limavady? Well, Limavady is a medium-sized town by our standards. It's about 15 miles east of Derry, halfway between Derry and Coleraine. Now that probably doesn't say a lot to most of you. So I was trying to find famous people from Limavady, and I'm afraid I failed. And then I was trying to find, major incidents that have happened at Limavady, and the only thing I could find, and I do apologize to anyone from Limavady, was that Richard Branson and his balloon touched down here when they made the transatlantic flight. So I'm afraid that's as much as I can say about Limavady. My connection to Limavady. Here's a little story. I don't know if this is the same everywhere, but in Ireland, there's always every town or little area has its great beauty. So, whether it's Rose from Tralee or Mary from Dunlow or Molly Malone in Dublin, all that sort of stuff. Actually, I don't know, what was the Rose of Tralee's name? It wasn't Rose, but anyway, the one for the Roe Valley, where Limavady is situated, is Finvola. Now, I saw this on Wikipedia and I thought, I know Finvola, because when I was in primary school, our class was getting ready to do a poem. I can't remember, like, we'd all go on the stage and we all do this poem. We all go, "'Twas the death of Finvola, the gem of the Roe," as if we'd all come from the home counties. And they needed a man to play the prince who came from overseas, Scotland, and the upside was you got to be the leading man. You didn't have any lines, but you were on the stage. The downside, you had to wear a kilt, and so you had to balance that kind of dangerous dynamic of a bit of fame versus getting teased mercilessly by your classmates. Needless to say, I went for the leading man option. So I can't even remember if the character had a name, but he came from the Isle of Islay, took the beautiful Finvola, the gem of the Roe, off to Islay. The family banshee did its thing, and Finvola, as always seems to be the case with these glamorous women, of course, she dies, and her husband is so upset that he refuses to send her body back to the Roe Valley until her family sends a delegation, and then he agrees for her to return to her natural resting place. Health. First up, she's a joy. She's in Scotland, in Glasgow. So it's been lovely to go on Zoom and to be able to include Gyda Meeten in our evenings. Take it away, Gyda.
The day the hospital lost my gran was the day I started to see her as a real person. The nurse had gone in to bring her breakfast, but the only sign that she'd ever been there was that there was a push-back sheet and a wee hollow where her body had been. My childhood Sunday afternoons were for visiting both sets of grandparents alternately, piling into Dad's silver Saab 900 to head to the other side of the city. Mum's parents were Grandpa Tom and Gran Margaret, and they lived in an ex-council house in a nice street in Paisley, just outside Glasgow to the west. Prosperous for a time, weaving and textile making, until economic hardship hit and most of the mills closed down. Grandpa Tom served in the desert in World War II till he was sent home to draw plans to rebuild the bombed out town. And he painted watercolours on paper we helped him stretch out and tape to boards, and kept a tin of old buttons for us to play with. Gran had lung disease, a lifetime of smoking having caught up with her, and would wheeze horrifyingly with her oxygen tubing over her shoulder. They were kind, sneaking us forbidden sweets when Mum and Dad weren't looking, and building a step for us to look out over the waste ground behind the garden to where the trains rushed past into Glasgow. And Misty, the next door Labrador, would take tea biscuits from our fingers through the fence, and Grandpa Tom dug holes in the lawn for us to practice our putting. Dad's folks lived in the next town along Renfrew, a little more genteel perhaps, with a history of shipbuilding and engineering, and we called them Gran and Grandpa Renfrew to make the distinction. Their house was a little less adapted for the grandchildren. Grandpa's pride and joy was his enormous record player set up, housed in a lacquered wood unit the size of an upright piano, where he would diligently record organ recitals and Bach preludes and fugues from the radio, cataloguing them with neatly labelled stickers. They had that shiny Izal medicated toilet paper that probably only those who grew up in the UK in the first half of the last century remember. It was like a kind of tracing paper with a strange mentholated smell and no absorption to speak of, just a strange smearing around your nether regions. I used to clench my bum cheeks till I got home rather than wrestle with the stuff. I feel guilty to think of it now, how much we prefer the Paisley trips with whooshing trains and illicit sweets to sombre afternoons of organ recitals and well-behaved sitting. But it felt a bit dreary in that house for a kid longing for more drama, or at least more sweets. Grandpa Renfrew was an engineer with Babcock's and spent his war designing boilers for warships. And the nearest he got to the fighting was when a Home Guard comrade shot him in the eye with a blank round. Engineering suited his organised mind, bent over the slide rule, calculating incomprehensible equations faster than anyone else in the office. And he came home for lunch every day of his career precisely at 12:30 in his precise suit and tie. Gran would have the table set and the broth warming and precisely 2 slices of bread buttered. And at precisely 1 o'clock, he would wipe his neat moustache and head back to the office. It was an orderly, quiet life for my dad growing up, restrained and diligent, with little time for playfulness. I suppose that was normal for most children of that post-war generation, arriving as they did into families devastated and reeling from years of chaos. But it's maybe not a surprise that my dad's medical career took him into pathology. Dead folks are generally neat and predictable, and specimens almost always follow the rules. I never saw my Gran and Grandpa Renfrew hold hands or hug each other, or my dad. I never once saw him slip an arm round her neat waist when we left them on their scrubbed front step. The dark wood panelled doors of their bedroom were always firmly closed when we visited, but I imagined they were separate twin beds with neat quilts pulled tight. I think Gran Renfrew must have had what we called PTSD now. She was intensely anxious all of the time, particularly around travelling in cars or buses. She'd witnessed a terrible accident of some sort in her younger years, and I'm hazy about the details, but I think it involved decapitation or some other horror movie style scene. But as a result, she struggled to leave the house. And if she did manage to come and visit us, she'd have to be transported in the back seat of the Saab with a grandchild on either side, holding tight to her shiny handbag. I remember her knuckles as white as a roller coaster rider for the half-hour trip back to our house. So, when Grandpa needed a stay in hospital for a cataract operation, there was grave concern about her ability to cope at home without him, even for a night. So Dad arranged a next door room in the hospital he sometimes did private work for, so that they wouldn't be separated for too long and they would be care close at hand. So imagine the shock of that poor nurse who realised that she'd gone missing overnight while Grandpa slept off his anaesthetic down the corridor. How were they going to explain that to Dr. Brown? The paperwork was going to be a nightmare. Luckily, the panic was short-lived and Gran was soon discovered, tucked sardine style into the single bed with her husband she'd not slept apart from for 50 years. And there they were, him in his stripy old gents PJs, bought specially for the hospital trip, her in her pink nightie with a neat bow tied at the neck. She told the nurse she'd felt frightened in the night and just wanted to be beside her Jim. I imagined her slipping barefoot out of her room and padding down the corridor to his, tucking herself in next to him before sinking back into a relieved sleep till morning. And it was such a surprisingly sweet image to me, a teenager by that time. All of a sudden, she was less the drab, anxious, elderly lady laying out the dull lunch table with precision. She was a woman who'd been a girl once, who'd fallen in love with a quiet, neat man who found joy in order, his tidy calculations bringing engines roaring into life in the bellies of ships. She'd once stood in a trim tailored dress and pillbox hat and promised to be with him in sickness and in health. And he'd once stood in his three-piece suit and promised to have her and hold her from that day forth. And maybe he knew all along that she needed the certainty of the 12:30 lunchtime and always being able to find the precise organ sonata that you needed. Maybe she found joy in the order of their home, the broth on the stove, and the future doctor studying at the dining table in the evenings. And maybe that closed bedroom door held a cosy double where at the end of their days they would lie and laugh together and fall asleep in each other's arms. I wish I'd been more curious about their lives before dementia took them away from each other and from us, but back then you just didn't ask things like that of your elders. But however unromantic they seemed to my teenage eyes, Jim and Marion's was a dignified, simple love story that held strong through sickness and in health. 4 strong walls keeping out the cold, and with a quiet beauty in there.
Gyda, you're I have no words for you. You're brilliant. What a lovely, beautiful, touching story. That is so. We know so little, don't we? Really, about what goes on between any couple.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic, and yet, the thing that stays with me is the ISIL medicated toilet paper.
Oh, why? What was that about?
Never understood why anyone thought that was even a viable idea.
No.
It's
Oh,
almost
just
like
horrendous.
it's almost like they'd never been to the loo. Oh, look, thank you so much. That was fantastic. How long ago now, when did they die then, your grandparents?
I was 18 when my granddad died, and then a couple of years after that, my gran passed away.
Yeah.
The dementia was a joy, actually, because she forgot to be anxious. So she spent the last few years of her life just really enjoying herself. She forgot she was frightened of things.